Hello my friends, welcome back to another Oxygen Not Included tutorial. This is going to be a new series of videos I'm going to put together for basic tutorials on as many different subjects as I can think of that I think people are going to get some use out of. And the first one that I wanted to start with is probably the hardest one to understand, which is automation. So what you're seeing on screen here is a big complicated automation setup, and I'm not expecting you to understand most of this right now because it's very complicated. Sometimes you need builds like this though, but there's also a lot of more simple builds and a lot of different reasons that you're going to be using automation. So if you were ever curious or if you want to know what the power of this is, it's a lot easier to go through a tutorial as opposed to just looking through this and saying, whoa, there's way too many options, I don't understand any of this. So this tutorial is going to walk you through a bunch of different use cases and realistic applications of various automation setups. So let's go ahead and jump into some basic examples. Okay, welcome to my filming sandbox, which is basically just a big open map that we can use to test all kinds of different stuff on, so that's where we're going to be now. Let's talk about the most basic parts of automation. One of the easiest things to use it for is just to return machines on and off, and this is something you can do manually by just using this button here, using the disable building button, but that does require a dupe to come and toggle it. But it's a lot easier for you to just toggle machines on and off by using the most simple piece of automation, which is this signal switch. So the basics of this is that if you put a signal switch down, you've got this that you can just control like a light switch, and the connection points need to be with an automation wire. So automation wires are going to look something like this. And if the automation wire is ever red, that means it's turning something off. If it's ever green, that's turning something on. So throughout this tutorial, I'll speak mostly in the on and off terms rather than green and red. It's a little bit easier to remember that way, or at least I think. So really basic usages. Let's take this signal switch and just turn it on, and what happens is it'll just start pumping water out. So when I turn that on, that turns this pump on, and there's a whole bunch of different reasons you would want to do stuff like this, and a whole bunch of reasons why you would connect that to more sophisticated automation. But doing it manually is possible. You know, you could do it for something like this if you wanted to turn on the gas pump, or if you wanted to open a door. There's a whole bunch of buildings that will take these inputs, so you can definitely use switches to do really basic stuff if you want to manage it that way. But the problem with this is that it still does require your attention, and if you have like 100 switches in your base, then you're going to forget about something. And it's easier just to get them on automation that's just going to do a specific task that you want without you needing to pay attention to it. So let's take a look at a couple of other really basic sensors. This one's called a hydro sensor. This sounds like just what it is. It basically just senses the level of certain liquid in an area. And when it's a certain liquid, you can turn it either on and off whenever it reaches certain parameters. So in this particular room, let's say I want to turn this off when it is above, or sorry, I want to turn this on when it's below 100 kilograms. So I want about 100 kilograms of water in here per tile. So let me go ahead and connect up the automation wire to open this up. Again, you can connect it to vents, and that's what I'm doing here. It should run until this fills up to about 100 kilograms, and it'll turn back off. You can definitely configure this however you want for whatever different reasons you want here. So hydro sensors are pretty straightforward concept. Basically just senses whatever kind of liquid's around it and how much it is, and there you go. Once we get to 100, it turns off. We could raise this, or we could say we want to send a green signal if it's above 100. So now that it's above 100, I want it to fill up even more. There's a whole bunch of different ways you could use these things, so feel free to play around with those. Atmo sensor, pretty much the same idea. We'll just go ahead and hook this up. It just works with gases instead of liquids. So you can see it immediately fills up to over 100 grams per tile, so immediately shuts this back off. So pretty straightforward sensors there if you wanted to ever play around with those. And the hydro sensor in particular is really useful for managing water in a whole bunch of different capacities, so feel free to check that out. Alright, next let's take a look at the Thermo sensors. Thermo sensors, again, should be pretty straightforward. Whenever you set up certain temperature requirements, it'll turn something on, and whenever those requirements are not met, it'll turn something off. So in this case, I have a real-life example of these bristle blossoms. These bristle blossoms require being at a certain temperature, and this temperature is going to be 41 to 86 Fahrenheit. In Celsius, you can go ahead and convert that if you want to, but it's basically a little bit above freezing to a little bit above like a comfortable room temperature. So if I have roughly room temperature water, that's what I want to feed these things. And I can use thermosensors to only pump the water that is going to meet the requirements of this bristle blossom. So in this tank, for example, I have like 107 degree water. That's way too hot. Whereas this one I have like 66 degree water, and that's exactly what I want. They can both be tuned to the exact same things. They're both tuned to pump water out if it's below 70. And if I connect both of these up, you'll see that only one of them is going to pump because it's the temperature of water that I want. So now there's water coming to these things. They're going to start growing. They're not going to go overheat. So lots of good stuff going on here. Especially useful if you're trying to actively cool down this water and this is your only water source. As soon as it gets cool enough, it'll pump it to your blossoms and it won't accidentally pump hot water that way. So really good, useful sensor to use for a whole bunch of different reasons, and bristle blossoms especially are one particular circumstance that they are very useful. So speaking of temperature management, let's take a look at another couple setups. This is an example of something that's going to probably happen in your base at some point. You're probably going to get a bunch of buildings that will allow you to create different things, but they're going to generate a ton of heat. So let me drop a couple of duplicants in here, like Gene and Ari. And what we're going to do is we're going to create ceramic. And this is going to generate a lot of heat from these buildings. And you need a way to cool that down so it doesn't overheat and ruin your machines or hurt your dupes or anything like that. So you will need some kind of cooling system to keep this thing cool. The best way that I've found to cool things is to start with some very cold water, and there's a whole bunch of different ways you could get cold water, like melting ice or using aqua tuners or something like that. So I'm going to run some pipe through this room and I'm going to circulate it using this liquid pump. But I only want to circulate the water if this room is hot enough. I don't want to just circulate it constantly, otherwise I'm just kind of wasting water, wasting energy trying to circulate it. So I'm only going to circulate it if it's above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So as soon as I connect this up to the pump, you can see that the water will start pumping, and there you go. The temperature should pretty much instantly drop. You can see the polluted water coming in at very low, and that'll keep this room nice and cool. You can see we've already satisfied the requirements for this thermo sensor, so it's back off. Packets of water coming through here, and they're just going to get dumped back in the same pool. So pretty straightforward setup there. But like I mentioned, there are a couple of other uses of automation, and one of them especially is to help save you power. And one way you can do that with your cooling setup is with something like this. These setups both look really similar, but this one uses a liquid shutoff so that we basically store water in these pumps in these pipes as long as we want it to. And then when it's too hot, we'll dump the water back into this tank and get new water cycled in here. I'll show you the difference between these two things in terms of how much more efficient a setup like this is. And it only requires one extra step, and that's this liquid shutoff. So now that we are asking for water, we're going to go ahead and turn on our cooling system. This being on is just going to allow the water to return back to its tank. Well, we're going to get a lot more efficient cooling out of this because the water is going to be stuck in these pipes for quite a while at a very low temperature, but we want it to be stuck in those pipes because that's going to allow it to absorb a lot of heat before we finally flush it and get new water in there. So you can see this is going to sit this room at about 60 degrees, whereas this one's still sitting a little bit hotter than that. But the benefit that we have of this type of setup is that there's no power being used here at all. Whereas every once in a while, we'll see on this setup over here, power will get used. And we can go ahead and kind of fake some of this stuff too by adding in some very hot oxygen just to try to activate these systems again. And you'll see that all this needs to do is just flush out a little bit of water before it'll finally reset. Whereas this one will just continually reset over and over and over and spend a lot more power. This is something I use in my own base, something that's very common to see in these types of bases, so I would recommend playing around with these liquid shutoffs just in the name of saving power. You can still see this hasn't run at all. This is again running again, trying to maintain this temperature. So I think you get the point of that by now. So let me go ahead and get rid of these dupes so they're not asking for things later. Let's move on to the next setup. This setup is going to be all about these gas element sensors, or just element sensors in general. These sensors should be pretty self-explanatory. Basically, if it senses a certain type of gas, it will turn something on. So in this case, if we're detecting carbon dioxide, I want to turn on this gas pump. This is going to be a really common scenario in your base, for example, because buildings and dupes and stuff like that will produce carbon dioxide. They'll usually sink down to the bottom of your base, and you'll usually have to get rid of them in one way or another. If you watched my walkthrough video, you'll know that I like to just blow these out into space. I think that's the easiest thing to do, and we'll mention why here in a little bit. So go ahead and hook this up, and just like it was promised, this is detecting carbon dioxide, and it's going to go ahead and start pushing some of the carbon dioxide out of here. And if it detects anything other than carbon dioxide, this is going to turn back off. Oh, it looks like my pipes aren't connected. There we go. Gotta fix some bugs. But yeah, once this stops detecting carbon dioxide, this is going to turn back off, and it should leave us with a room of mostly oxygen. This isn't the most foolproof way to do this, and this is why I have more setups to kind of refine this down below. But that's the basics of this gas element sensor. I do want to run until this is eventually turned off. I don't know how long we're going to have to wait to see that. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so now that it's detecting oxygen, it's like, okay, there's no reason for me to be on, since my whole purpose is just to get rid of carbon dioxide. So now we're just left with a room full of oxygen, so that's great. But like I said, this is not the most foolproof setup. Let's take a more real-world example into this and saying that you have more than just one gas in your base, or one gas you want to get rid of. In this case, we want to get rid of carbon dioxide and chlorine. And you can store your chlorine if you want to, but most of the time you're just going to get rid of it. So I'm just going to put a setup here for this, and this setup looks really similar to the one above, except now we have two gas element sensors. One of them is looking for carbon dioxide, the other one's looking for chlorine. And these are connected to an OR gate. An OR gate is basically takes in two inputs, and if either of those are on, it's going to send a signal to turn something on. So this basically, like if you want to condense this down, and this always helps me think about automation, if I'm detecting either carbon dioxide or chlorine, turn the vent on, or sorry, turn on the pump. And then that will hopefully get rid of all the gases except for the oxygen that's in this little room, and should be good. And just like the last one we saw, we should be left with a room full of oxygen here. I think that this is demonstrating the point reasonably enough. I don't know if we're going to stick around for too long. But you can see as soon as the gases shift, this is now not detecting carbon dioxide anymore. And this should turn on here in just a second once it starts detecting chlorine, and there we go. So you can see it's only turning on when it's detecting gases that we don't want. So that setup will work for most cases. Again, I think we can make this better. So let's take a look at another case. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this so it's not making noise. Another case, and this is also very common, is that you have more than like 3 gases that are sitting in here that you don't want to have just sitting around your base. So I added a natural gas, which is going to start showing up if you have, you know, leaks from other systems, or some buildings can produce it, or maybe you have a flatulent dupe or something like that. Natural gas can and probably will eventually get into your base, and I don't want to keep adding a whole bunch of OR gates and a whole bunch of extra sensors to detect the elements one by one. I'd rather just do it all together, and the way I can do it now is with a NOT gate, and this is going to invert the signal of whatever you are sending. So what I'm going to do for this setup is I'm going to detect oxygen, and if I send that through a NOT gate and connect it to my pump, what this says as like a readable sentence is that I want this to turn on if this sensor is detecting anything other than oxygen. So if it's detecting carbon dioxide, or if it's detecting chlorine, or if it's detecting natural gas, it'll activate this circuit and it'll turn it on. And this is nothing more complicated than just a simple NOT gate. All it does is just take whatever is the opposite of what you're passing in and send it out. So, like I said, the easily readable sentence here is that I'm getting rid of everything other. I'm turning this on if this is detecting anything other than oxygen. A couple other additions we added here, and something you'll want to do, which we just saw. Sometimes we'll grab natural gas, and sometimes we'll send it into our little machine here to get some energy. So definitely a useful setup if you add a gas filter that filters for natural gas. And I know this isn't automation, but it's going to make sense here in just a bit. There's a couple of things about this that I don't like, though. One of which is that occasionally when we're sucking stuff up, this is not the most foolproof setup. You can see oxygen occasionally gets into our pipes here, and we're occasionally just blowing it out into space. And we don't want to do that. Like, we could have put a lot of work into producing this oxygen, so I don't want to just get rid of it. So let's make this setup even better. The next setup I want to look at, let me disconnect this, is something like this. This looks pretty much exactly the same, except I added another filter. This other filter is just to return oxygen. This should be pretty straightforward by now. Exact same setup. I want to turn this on if anything other than oxygen is detected here. So we're sending it through. And you'll see eventually, if we were to sit here and watch long enough, you'll see natural gas get routed to our generator. And you will see oxygen returned back to our room. And that's exactly what we want if we're managing a ventilation for like a large base or something like that. Definitely don't want to be wasting any gases that have value. And the value in oxygen is for your dupes to be able to breathe it. Value in the natural gas is to generate energy from it. So pretty simple setup here. I'm going to show one last example that's going to show off a couple of other things, but this is a pretty advanced example for this one. I don't expect you to emulate this exactly, but I'll explain why you'll see this occasionally. I want to make this setup a little bit better with something like this. And the reason I want to make this better is because the power requirements that's used for these filters makes this system consume about double what the pump would actually require anyway. These filters can get kind of expensive, so I'd rather do a cheaper option than that. So if you see the power consumption of these things down here, which are effectively going to do the exact same thing, it's only 10 watts as opposed to 120. The way this is set up is these are on gas pipe element sensors, and these just sense elements inside of a gas pipe. Pretty straightforward. And I'll have these gas shutoffs turn on and off, which are basically the sister object to one of these liquid shutoffs. Basically allows a connection of pipes to be opened or closed depending on what you want. And in this case, this first gas element sensor is going to be looking for natural gas. The second one is going to be looking for oxygen. Again, just like these filters were up here. Of course, with the natural gas, we want it to be routed to our machine here to produce some power. With our oxygen, we want it to be routed back into our room. This setup here, exactly the same. I want this to turn on if it's anything other than oxygen. So I'm going to go ahead and connect this, and we'll see how this works. So the piping looks something like this. As soon as we see natural gas come along, I'll try to pause it as soon as it gets there. It should activate this shutoff here, and that will allow the gas to pass from this to here and down this pipe. Otherwise, it'll keep going along the main line. It'll get examined by this setup, and if it's oxygen, it'll go along this pipe. So let's try to catch it here in action. There we go. So now our sensor's on because this block of pipe is sensing natural gas, which is going to turn this gas shutoff on, and it's going to allow the natural gas to pass through. And there you go. Here's a packet of oxygen coming down, and as soon as it hits this one, it'll turn it on. It'll say, hey, I detect oxygen in this pipe. It'll do the exact same thing of turning on this gas shutoff because we wired it that way, and it'll come out of the pipe. And there we go. So this ventilation setup, roughly this exact setup is what I use in real games. And you can see that just in the however many minutes we've been in this section, we've gone from extremely simple things to kind of advanced things. I'm going to show one more thing that are actually two more things that are kind of straightforward. Like they're a little complicated, but they all show off new things, and they show off real world examples. So let's take a look at this. Here's a problem that you might have. You might have some water that has food poisoning germs in it. You definitely don't want your dupes to be drinking this or making food out of it or using it for oxygen or anything like that. So one of the best ways to deal with this is by using this liquid tepidizer. This basically just heats up liquid. This is very common to do for water. So what I want to do is I want to turn this thing on whenever there's germy water in here, but I don't want to just have it running all the time because these are really expensive. And I don't want to heat this unnecessarily if I need to cool it again for bristle blossoms or something. So what I have this hooked up to is a germ sensor. This germ sensor is going to turn on if it detects anything above 10 germs in whatever tile it's in. So right now we're detecting 86,000 germs because that's what the food poisoning level is in this water. And I also only want this to turn on if we're below 110 degrees Fahrenheit because I don't want to heat this up too much, but I do want to get the water hot enough to the point that it'll start killing the germs. If you click on the water and go to the germs tab here, it'll tell you how much is dying. It dies at 3% per cycle, but that's pretty slow for most bases, so I'm just going to go ahead and hook this up. And, oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, these are both connected to an AND gate. This is different from an OR gate. So OR gate says, if either one of these are good, then I'm going to turn this thing on. If either one of these things are on, I should say. So that's what the OR gate does. Either one can be on. The AND gate is different. The AND gate says that both of them have to be on for this to turn on. So I'm only going to turn on this liquid tepidizer if there are germs in the water and the water is not already heated up. So let's go ahead and run this for a little bit, and this will take a little while to actually heat it up to the level that we want. But it might not be too long, I don't know. Okay, it's going pretty fast. Once we get there, you can start looking at the water, and once you get to a certain temperature, it's like 105 Fahrenheit roughly, you'll start seeing extra bonuses here for killing germs. It should show up here any second. But once you heat up to that level, that's at the point where I'm like, okay, cool, this is good enough for me. I don't want to keep this tepidizer running for any longer than it needs to be, and there you go. Current temperature, 104. The germs are dying at 30% dead per cycle. And again, I don't want to heat this up unnecessarily, and I also don't want this to run if there's no germs in the water. So again, to review the logic here, I want this to run only if the germs are detected, and if the water's already not hot enough. Once the water gets hot enough, this thing will turn back off, which we'll just go ahead and kind of force here. Let's use our handy dandy heat gun. Heat it up. And there we go. Now the water is sitting at about 117 in this area. Once any one of them turns off, the tepidizer turns off because we're passing it through the AND gate. So that looks pretty good. I mean, this is a setup that I use in my games as well. Pretty straightforward, so definitely something that's worth copying, I would say. And for the last setup in the basic section, we're going to go through some more advanced builds here in just a bit. But for the last setup, you're going to eventually get to a point where you want to be on oil power. There's a couple of problems that this poses. This needs to be run with petroleum, but usually the petroleum is really hot. So I have like 260 degree petroleum down here. That's definitely not something you want to be sitting in your base, heating it all up and, you know, messing it up or whatever. So what I'm going to do is I have pipes connected from a pump down in the petroleum up to a liquid reservoir. This liquid reservoir has its own parameters on here to send automation signals. So this is going to basically say what are the levels that you want to keep in this tank. And I don't want to keep too much, but I do want to make sure that this doesn't run out of petroleum before I pump more up there. Like, I want this to be continually running once I get there. So I want it to, let's say, request when it's between these numbers. So if it's 20% full to 40% full, that's ideal. Anything other than that is not ideal. And you can see the automation signal being sent. So now that we are below 20%, so we're below our minimum that needs to be in this tank. So this is going to send an automation signal that says, hey, I need more petroleum, and it's going to come down to here, and it's going to turn this liquid pump on. So the pump is going to be pumping petroleum up. It's going to fill this tank. The tank is eventually going to fill up these generators, and the generators are going to run and produce power for us. The reason that I have this on this reservoir like this is because I could just pump this straight into the tank and keep a full tank. Two problems there, though. One is that that's going to produce a lot of extra heat. I don't want that much petroleum to be sitting around in my base if I can help it. And two, it's going to generate heat if there's ever things sitting in these pipes. So when I don't need any more petroleum, I want the petroleum to stay here. I don't want it to be anywhere else other than here and a small buildup in this tank for when I'm going to be using it, just to help maintain my heat the best I can. So that's a pretty simple setup for these reservoirs, and there's a lot of things that have this, like there's gas reservoirs that you could do this with. There's a whole bunch of buildings that have these types of inputs and outputs. Man, I'm like really stumbling here. But yeah, once you eventually meet the required amount, let's actually lower this even further. Let's say like 10 to 15%. Once it reaches 15%, it'll be like, cool, I have enough now, I'm not going to ask for any anymore, and it'll turn back off. Let's talk about a smart battery as well. Anytime you build power, you should probably be running it on a smart battery, even like your very first power sources like coal. The reason you want to do this is because if you see these inputs here, this has the same idea for the battery. So you basically define what are your acceptable ranges for this battery's charge. I'll usually say anywhere between like 20 and 80%. And since we're below 20 right now, this is going to be like, hey, I need charge. Send out a positive signal to turn on whatever I'm connected to. So now that I'm connected to it, we're going to get petroleum into these things. They're going to start charging it up. And as soon as it reaches 80%, it's going to turn this back off. So now this is sending a red signal or an off signal, basically saying like, I'm good. I have enough charge. I don't need any more. Turn off. This helps you for a bunch of different reasons, but the main reason is that, especially if you're running on petroleum, this petroleum is really valuable. And you definitely don't want, whoops, little spoiler alert there, we'll get to that in just a second. You definitely don't want to burn this petroleum unnecessarily. You want to ration this according to how much you actually need, based upon this battery charge. If you had something connected to this that was consuming a lot of power, this would eventually turn this back on, and this would conserve your petroleum as much as possible. By the way, you can see our tank is now satisfied. Our tank is now sending a red signal, so we are not unnecessarily pumping or storing petroleum anywhere. So those two things are good. Like I said, these container type of objects have these controls on there basically to define what are acceptable ranges for this thing. And if it's not at an acceptable range, as in it's too low, it'll turn on. If it's too high, it'll turn off, and it'll stay off until it reaches this amount again. One last thing I want to talk about in this basic section, and yes, I know this is going to be a very long video because automation is very confusing and hard to deal with, but I'm going to talk a little bit about this automatic notifier. This can be really useful if you need to know about whenever you are going to have like resource problems, for example. So what I have here is this automated notifier, and we can say whatever we want. Let's say, hey jerk, no petroleum, like that. And then the tooltip can give us a little bit more information. Be like, hello, jerk, you need more petroleum. And I can spell. And there's a type that you can do, like you can do all kinds of different stuff. You could pause the game if this happens. You could have it zoom in on there. You could do all kinds of different alerts with this to notify you of when some kind of problem is happening in your base. So let's go ahead and let's set this to, I don't know, maybe like, if this is below 200, I'm going to say that this is like an emergency. I need to do something about this if this ever reaches this level. So I'll be like, okay, cool, let's be over here, let's see what we were doing. I'm going to unpause the game. And this thing is going to eventually be notified, or it's eventually going to get a green signal that something bad is happening. And when that happens, it should grab your attention, although I may have just bugged it out because it did happen earlier. So maybe we could just quickly set this up again. Let's go ahead and turn that off. Hydro sensor. Set up an automation wire. And there we go. Hey jerk, no petroleum. You need more petroleum. And I can figure out what this is telling me about, and it'll alert me to something that's an immediate emergency going on. I have gotten used to not needing to use this very often, but if you're just starting out and learning, this is one of the most helpful things in the game. So I definitely recommend checking that out. So that's what I've got for the basic section of automation. The rest of the sections are going to be for more advanced concepts and more advanced buildings, and finally going back to my real base and seeing all these things actually in action. So I'll be right back with the next section of advanced builds. Okay, let's take a look at some advanced automation builds. This is going to seem a little less advanced than it actually is. Some of these are fairly straightforward, but let's talk about them. So this setup ought to look a little bit familiar as we had before. This is just cooling off something that's going to be producing a lot of heat. The big overview is that there's some magma down here. It's heating up some steam, which is being used by these steam turbines to generate energy. And whenever you generate energy with these steam turbines, they're going to put off a lot of heat, which means I need to keep them cool. So what I have in this room, I again have a whole bunch of polluted water that's really cool that I'm going to use to absorb the heat from all this stuff, and we're going to cycle it through like we did before with the other build. As you can see, a liquid shutoff there. You might notice this. This is new. This is a buffer gate. And the whole purpose behind the buffer gate is that it retains a green signal for much longer than the original thing was sending it at. So let's say this is supposed to be detecting anytime the temperature is above 80 degrees. Rather than turning this on and then immediately back off whenever this thing changes back and forth from 80 degrees, I want to keep this on for a little bit longer so that I can flush the entire section of this pipe out to get the most efficient cooling possible, rather than just flushing a little bit and keeping a bunch of hot polluted water in here for longer. So what I'll do is I'll take a thermo sensor, I'll connect it up to a buffer gate. That buffer gate is set to 60 seconds right now, which we can just fudge this here in just a little bit, but it's set to 60 seconds to stay on and to continue allowing liquid to flow through this liquid shutoff. The purpose behind this, and again, it's always easy for me to boil this down to like a human sentence as far as how something is functioning. When this is eventually tripped, I want this to allow water to cycle for 60 seconds, and that's basically enough time to flush all of the water out of all these pipes, put all of the warm water back in here, and get brand new cool water. So let me go ahead and fudge this here really quickly. Let me sample this, fill it up with hot hydrogen. Sure, that's probably good. So we'll go ahead and fill this up. So once this goes ahead and detects the hotter... Well, what the... This is trolling me super bad because it's not filling up. Is it good now? Yeah, okay. It may also be trolling me a little bit because this is actually harder than I think it is to force the temperature like that. So you just saw it fleck there for just a second. It just barely went above 80 and then immediately dropped because we're cycling cold water. But what's going to happen is once it detects that this is too hot, the buffer gate will stay on for 60 seconds before it allows us to turn back off. And that's again just to allow the whole room to flush. Even though this sensor is already like, I don't know, seems good to me, we know better to know that the whole room is not cooled down to that degree yet. So we're just going to let it flush until it's all the way out, and then we're going to stop. And then the pipes are going to be filled up with this cool water again. It's just going to sit there for a little while, and eventually this will repeat. So buffer gates, in a nutshell, are basically to send a green signal for longer than something was originally. Let's take a look at the opposite of that. Let's take a look at filter gates. Filter gates prevent a green signal from being sent for a while. So in this case, you may have noticed this setup from earlier. I'm going to set this to, I don't know, 60 seconds. This setup from earlier was basically how to vent gases that we don't want from an otherwise oxygenated environment. So I have the same setup here, which is a oxygen element sensor, and that's connected to a NOT gate, which is again going to invert the signal. So this is saying I want this to turn on any time this is detecting anything other than oxygen. I'm going to pass it through a filter gate for 60 seconds though before it allows the green signal to pass all the way through to my gas pump. And the reason I want to do this is because I want this to prove... That wasn't 60 seconds, that was 5 seconds. Game's trolling me, but you can set it for any amount of time. But I want this thing to prove to me that, like, oh, you're detecting anything other than oxygen? I want you to show me that you can detect it for 60 seconds straight, and not necessarily just like a stray carbon dioxide passing by or something like that. So once we empty this out, we'll go ahead and fudge this just a little bit and show and kind of demonstrate what you could see when that happens. So right now, it turned off. It said, I detected oxygen, we're good. Now we're going to go ahead and drop a little bit of carbon dioxide in there, but not very much, just so that we can get the effect that we're looking for of it'll detect carbon dioxide for just a second, but it won't allow the pump to turn on unless it's been there for a while. So drop a little bit. Oh man, I'm sampling. What am I doing? Performing is hard. All right, here we go. So dropped a little bit of carbon dioxide in there. This is detecting it by saying, oh, there's something other than oxygen here. And we're going to say, okay, well, you need to detect that for a long time before I allow this to actually get pumped out. Because realistically speaking, this is still mostly oxygen. I don't want to pump all this out unless there's enough carbon dioxide for this to make it actually worthwhile. So that's the point of the filter gate, is just to delay the green signal from coming through for a set amount of time. It's the exact opposite of the buffer gate. Let's take a look at another application of buffer gates, but also a new sensor, which is called the cycle sensor. This is going to basically activate or deactivate at certain times of the day. So you could set it to something like this, and you can see what parts of the day are going to be active and inactive. And this red marker is where we currently are in the day. Something that I practically do for this is I set up a drowning tank for a bunch of excess critters just to generate a lot of meat. And I'll use buffer gates to close some doors here that will force the water upward until it eventually covers this whole thing. If I were to close these all at the same time, it would delete a lot of the water here, just because that's one of the side effects of oxygen not included's engine. And the nature of having these things in like these tiles, if they don't have anywhere to displace those, like within a couple tiles distance, it'll just delete them, because it's like, I don't know what else you want me to do with this, I give up. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to set this to be active for most of the day, maybe like 75% of the day. What I would typically do is when my dupes are sleeping or something like that, that's when I'll kill the critters. But just because we're doing it now, let's have it start up here in just a second. So I'm going to set it to, I don't know, this is like the afternoon or so, roughly. And then each one of these is going to be hooked up to, or rather, this is going to be hooked up to a whole bunch of buffer gates. Again, these buffer gates are going to keep the signal green for a set amount of time. So I want these to close in sequential order. So I want this to stay open for not much time at all. I want this to stay open for about another 10 seconds, this for about another 20 seconds, and this for about another 30 seconds. What you'll see and what the effect from this is we'll let this run for just a little bit, and I'll kind of make this a little quicker. Once it gets into the red, it'll send a red signal. Now all these things are getting red signals right now, but they're all closing sequentially. So this one waited for 0.1 seconds and then it closed. This one's going to wait for 10 seconds and it's going to close. This one's going to wait for 20 and so on. And eventually it's going to force the water up, and it'll keep going up. It'll even drown the critters that can fly, and it can drown the critters that can climb on the ceiling and stuff, up until the point where you can keep them submerged for long enough. And I have this tuned to be about 25% of the day, because that's about how long it takes for these guys to die. They'll turn into meat, and I'll have a lot of great food. And I know this looks totally barbaric, but it's one of the most efficient ways to get food in the game. So, yeah, we're not nice people on this asteroid, but we definitely use automation to make fancy setups like this. And the cycle sensor is really the thing that makes this all work. You could do this manually if you wanted to put this on like a regular signal switch. It doesn't necessarily have to be a cycle switch. But again, the cycle switch is just there so you don't have to remember when to go back and do it. And now that the thing is going to go back into the green, all the doors are going to open, and yay, now we can get our meat. We could have also just shipped it out, but you know, whatever. So yeah, cycle sensors, pretty neat. Let's take a look at another example. Here's another thing that I have in my base usually. I have a tank of water. That's a warm water. It's a little too warm than I would like for bristle blossoms, so I have a bunch of ice that I've mined. So what I'll want to do here is I'll want to fill up some boxes down here with some ice, but these are only going to fill up at times that I want them to. I don't want them to overfill this. I don't want them to make this water like super duper cold. I want it to be at a good temperature here. So my logic in this setup is that I have a Thermo sensor, and I also have this smart storage bin. And these are both connected. Sorry, the smart storage bin is connected to a NOT gate, which is eventually connected to an AND gate. The human readable sentence of this setup is, I want dupes to fill up this box if there's nothing already there, and if the water is hot enough. So if this is anywhere above, let's say, I don't know, 70 degrees, and if there's nothing inside this box, then I want this door to open and I want it to allow dupes to come in here. Now this is coming from the AND gate into an OR gate because there's one other thing that I don't want to mess up, and I'll show you why. So let me grab a duplicant, or more specifically spawn one. Hello, Camille. Now this is open because it's saying, hey, there's nothing in this box. This is sending a red signal, which I'm inverting because I want it to send green when it's empty, meaning that I want this door to be open when it's empty. This is also saying the water's too hot, like we need to lower this water temperature. So going through the AND gate, both of them are satisfied. Go into the OR gate, eventually to open the door. So Camille, we need you to fill up these boxes with ice. Let's go ahead and ask for it. I'm going to ask for a fairly low amount here, just because I want it to melt a little bit quicker. Camille, hurry up and get to work. Come on, everybody's watching. Don't embarrass me. Why do you always do this? We want her to fill up these boxes. Oh man, you are terrible at filling these up. Alright, let's not ask for that much. 200, sure, whatever. I wouldn't normally set it this low, but Camille's really slow. Alright, there we go. So Camille's going to fill these up, and yay, cool. Oh no! Now Camille's stuck. This is bad for us. We don't want this to happen. So one thing you can do to help avoid this is you can set up a duplicant motion sensor, and you can set that up and have that connected to the OR gate as well, so that if either a dupe is stuck in here, or this is actually asking for ice, then we're going to open the door. Now that the door is open, yay, Camille can leave, and she's happy, and she's just going to stand in the door now. Get out of there. And then it closes back up when she's not in there. So this is basically like a fancy way to make sure that you can fill up this tank with water, or with ice, and cool off the water that's in here, but also allow your dupes out and not get them trapped here. So that's one of the few instances I've seen this duplicant motion sensor be useful. There's probably a whole bunch of other ways you could do cool stuff with it, so feel free to play around with that. Last one. This is the last example before we're going to go back to the real base and take a quick tour of actual working setups with this automation. So the last setup I'm going to talk about is when you get out into space, which is going to be out here, which which is going to be out here, you're going to get hit by a bunch of meteors. So what's going to happen is you're going to have bunker doors here, or at least you should, unless you want all your stuff to break. And you'll probably get some meteors coming down here, like so. And when they smash in... Oh, I put it too close to the top. Let's do some real ones. Let me copy these. There we go. Spawner, some rock comets. What happens with these rock comets is once they hit... Uh-oh. No, don't hurt me. Well, this is what we did to ourselves, guys. Okay, I don't think it's going to hit anything. Okay, we're good. Anyway, what happens is once these hit your bunker doors, they leave behind a bunch of Regolith, and this Regolith's really hot. So I don't want this falling into my base, I don't want it messing anything up, but I need a way to get rid of this. So one thing that I do, if you've watched my walkthrough videos, is I use these mechanized airlocks to smash the Regolith down. And I do this by hooking them up to a bunch of other things, but one of them is also this timer sensor. The timer sensor will send inverting signals every so often. I'll reset this. So every 10 seconds it's going to open the doors and close the doors. And what happens is when they open, the Regolith will fall in, timer sensor will go back to red, and it'll crush it. It'll basically delete the Regolith, and I just repeat this process until all the Regolith is gone, and there, now I don't have any Regolith, and we're done. The problem is that I don't want this to run forever. I eventually just want these to sit open, because the point of this is to add some kind of access to space for either solar panels or for a telescope or something like that. So let me go ahead and stop this. So this is a mimic of my real setup for an actual game. And what you want here is you're going to have Regolith stacked on top of bunker doors, and your solar panels won't be able to work until you actually clear that Regolith in some way. So you could, you know, put out some dig orders for your dupes and have them come over here and dig it all out. That can be annoying, though. I don't want to have to do that every single time. So instead, we're going to smash it down. We need to connect to all this business before we can actually use it. So let's talk about this piece by piece. First of all, the thing you need is a space scanner. The space scanner is going to detect meteor showers, and that's what these meteors were. So if it detects a meteor shower, it's going to send a green signal. Now we want this to be inverted because whenever this is not detecting anything, we want these doors to be open, basically saying it is safe for you to be open right now, and we want to open this up, we want to clear the Regolith, and we want these things to function. So I have this going from the space scanner into a NOT gate. The NOT gate will get connected to the doors. So let's go ahead and open them up. Once I open these up, it'll take a little while for them to open. A couple of other things need to happen here, though, and I'm probably going to disconnect and rebuild some of this in a little bit. But I want these mechanized airlocks to only smash the Regolith at set times. I don't want it to be going off all the time, otherwise these solar panels are only going to be working like half the time. So what I can do is I'm going to send the signal from this NOT gate, basically this green signal that's telling the doors to open. I'm going to send it into a filter gate. This filter gate should be set for about 45 seconds, and I know this is all going to get messed up, so I might just actually undo this. Let me run this for just a little bit. Just to get the timers set up. Wish they would update quicker, but they don't. Maybe someday they will. But what I want to do is I want to send this green signal into a filter gate. This filter gate is going to wait to send a green signal to the rest of my system until roughly these doors are all the way open. I usually set this for about 45 seconds because that's about how long it takes for these doors to open. After 45 seconds, what's going to happen is I'm going to go to this signal counter. This is another automation tool that you can use to basically do things that are done once and then immediately like undo themselves after a set amount of time. So once the signal counter gets to 1, you can set it to whatever you want, but once it gets to 1, it will send a green signal out. So the timer's going off on our filter gate. Once this timer is up, it's going to make this go to 1. And that's going to send a green signal. The green signal is eventually going to be the other piece that we need in this AND gate to eventually cause this system to turn on and crush the Regolith, and then eventually turn back off when this goes back to 0. So the first part of that is that we have this timer sensor hooked up to an AND gate, and we also have the output of the signal counter in this AND gate as well. It's being inverted afterwards with a NOT gate because we want the resting state of these doors to be open rather than closed. And then it goes to the doors. Now once you get to that point, the second part of this is we eventually need to turn the system off after a set amount of time. So after 90 seconds of this thing being on 1, I have a automation cable going into the reset port of the signal counter to reset it back to 0. So, that's a mouthful, and I'm probably going to talk about this quite a few times, but once we get the signal up to 1, we're going to now start activating the system. The signal counter is now sending a green signal. Both of these are green going into the AND gate, meaning that both things are satisfied. We're going into a NOT gate that'll tell the doors to close. Now, once the doors are closed for a little bit of time, this will eventually send a red signal, and since both things that go through an AND gate need to send a red signal, need to send a green signal in order to send it through, it'll actually open the doors. I know that I'm stumbling through this, but this is very complicated to try to describe. This filter gate here is basically acting as the timer for how long this system will stay on. After a certain amount of time, I know visually the Regolith is cleared. Like, we're good. We don't need to keep smashing Regolith like this, and we can eventually tune this to be whatever we want to make it a little bit more accurate. But once this runs out, this will send a green signal to the reset port of the signal counter. This will reset it back to 0, and these doors will just stay open. There you go, and there you go. Done. Now we have full view of space. There's no junk in our way, and our solar panels could work. That is, they would work if we actually had light coming down here, but we don't. But I think you get the point. And this is about the most complicated automation setup I have. I've done some other silly ones for build videos and stuff like that. And I think if you watch my top 10 video, there's a machine in there that I made that was a sour gas like condenser. It had a silly amount of automation, but this is about as complicated as I'll get in a regular run. And this is to serve a very direct purpose, and it's all just a collection of different components that you can put together to make all sort of interesting effects. So let's go ahead and check out my base, which I did in my walkthrough videos. We'll check some of these systems out and see how they're functioning in a real environment that actually got us to winning the game, just to kind of help illustrate the usefulness of automation, kind of close out the video. So I'll see you there in a sec. Okie dokie, welcome back to the walkthrough crew base if you've been here before. If not, this was for my walkthrough videos that basically showed an entire playthrough from the first to the last cycle while completing all of our objectives here. So that's exactly where this has left off if you were watching those videos. And I just keep this base around to show examples of different things. So let's go ahead and jump into just some basic examples, and we'll go up the scale of, simple to complex. So the most simple thing, and like we started before, basic signal switch. This one's just going to a polymer press, so that if I want plastic, I turn it on. If I don't want plastic, I turn it off. Pretty basic usage of stuff there. Same thing goes for like this gold volcano. I have this auto sweeper on a switch. If I turn it on, then it'll start picking up gold and it'll start shipping it out so that I can use it to build whatever I need refined metals for. So you can see it'll eventually flow up these conveyor belts. You can see it flowing up through here to get cooled in this cool water, and there you go. So basic stuff for that. As far as like thermo sensors, there's one here for my pool of cold water, which I showed a couple times throughout the tutorial. This one's just hooked to a pump. You can see it turns on if it's anywhere above 35 degrees. That pump will lead down to this Thermo aqua tuner to eventually cool it and send it back in, just to keep this tank of water nice and cold to cool other things around my base. Just for fun, let's take a look at my plumbing setup here. It looks like a disaster, but this pool of water is cooling things like this steam turbine setup, which we talked about a little bit just in that video. It's cooling like this big whole room here, which is where all my hot stuff is. You can see it's keeping it nice and chilly. So, looking pretty good there. But yeah, all this is just thermo sensors. Just like we talked about before, there's the same basic kind of setup where I have the water basically sitting in pipes in this room just to absorb some heat. And when I want to dump it out, I send it through a buffer gate and dump it out. So, pretty standard stuff that we saw in the video, and you can see this actually is working in a real game, which is kind of the whole point of this. So I'm going to take a look at a bunch of other systems here and just kind of breeze through these real quick. Here's an Atmo sensor inside my natural gas chamber right next to a geyser. This is set to pump something out if it's ever above 2 kilograms, and that's also set to a buffer gate of 15 seconds. And again, this setup, just for the usefulness of it, and I'll show the whole connection, pretty straightforward. But the whole point of this is to make sure that I'm not spending power pumping out just a little bit of natural gas. My natural gas is so backed up by now that this isn't really working exactly how it's intended. Like, this room is totally full of natural gas, so it can't actually pump it in right now, but kind of get the point of a setup like this. You can see it's replicated right here too, because I got a bunch of these in this base. Ventilation we saw a lot in the previous sections, so this should look very familiar. Gas element sensor sensing oxygen, sending it through a NOT gate and eventually into a filter gate before we actually pump out anything we don't want. And you can see the end result is that everything inside this room is oxygen, so my dupes can run around and work in here without needing to spend power or extra things on oxygen for suits for them. And it just pumps out the gases that I don't want, which will leave you with a little layer of gases that are kind of junk gases sitting down here that'll eventually get cycled back into somewhere useful or just blown out into space. So we saw that same setup before. Start getting a little bit more complicated. Here's a bunch of the smart batteries that I talked about. They're all hooked up to different types of power sources so that I can control when I want to use certain resources. So the coal is on 80-20, for example. This is on 80-40, meaning I don't want to use it as aggressively. I could always change this if I wanted to, so I could set it to something like this if I wanted to use my natural gas a lot more aggressively. Stuff like that for these smart batteries. Same things with the tank, which was another example that we talked about. So I have a tank full of petroleum down here and another tank here to receive crude oil. This crude oil is hooked up to a very long line that eventually goes down to a liquid shutoff so that I don't have these pipes filled with hot oil. It'll basically send it up whenever I need more for my tank, and it'll turn it off when I don't need more. So that's how I've got it set up right now. Could probably be a little bit more generous with these numbers, but you know, whatever, it worked. Let's talk about the drowning tank, which we did see. It should be full right now. Yeah, here we go. So same setup as before, but you can see it actually above my actual chambers where I have my dupes occasionally move critters in there to get more meat. We should see these things die here in just a second, so maybe I'll just hold on this awkwardly until that happens. So you can see them turning into meat and eventually get shipped back to a place where they're going to get cooked and eaten. So see that here in just a bit, but again, the automation setup is exactly the same as what I showed in the video before. Get these long loads later in the game, but there you go. A bunch of buffer gates, all in different timings. Should have seen this exact setup before. There go the critters dying, shipping meat out of here. Gonna go over to get cooked here in just a little bit, but yeah, you get the point if you've seen that previous part. I'm just going to show a handful more builds here. This isn't meant to be super structured, just to basically say, like, the things that we learned can be applied into basic games, so that we're not basically making recommendations for things that are not very practical. Here's something for a hydrogen vent, and this is going to be a little bit different than what you've seen before, but basically I want to pump the hydrogen out here. I want to be able to open and close this door if the hydrogen's at the right temperature. So it comes out of here way too hot. I want to cool it down a little bit with this steam and these metal tiles. I want to make sure I have hydrogen in here, first of all, just to absorb some of the heat and spread it out. And I want to be able to open that door when it's below 280 degrees Fahrenheit, which is then hooked up to a fancy system up here, which again has the same kind of cooling loop. You can see the radiant pipes in the background filled with that cool, polluted water. Yeah, pretty straightforward setup there. There's also some stuff you could do with the oxygen, which we talked about just a little bit, and how you can filter the oxygen coming through here with these gas pipe element sensors. This is not a super optimized oxygen setup. You could be a lot more optimized by using like Atmo sensors and fancy stuff like that, but a lot of times it'll get backed up anyway because you're not always producing exactly as much as you need for your base. But again, like automation, you can always make things more or less complicated depending on exactly what you need. But yeah, setup right here, bunch of manual switches, got the automated stuff just to get the hydrogen out of these pipes and sent down to another generator, which is something like this. Yeah, I'm kind of meandering here. Let's talk about a couple more setups and then we'll just call it good. Here's my water setup. Automation looks just a little bit complicated, but The whole idea here is I have a tank of Germy water at the top, a tank here that's meant to clean the Germy water, which this setup should look fairly similar to what we talked about before. This water is going to be where I used to cool it. I don't need cool water anymore because I'm not growing bristle blossoms, but that's what I used to have it. Then this was just to hold any excess cool water, just so I had plenty of extra stuff. And this is all just hooked up to a basic automation system that says like, hey, I'm the bottom tank, I have no water, I need water. And if the temperature's good here, then just open the door and let the water fall in, just to kind of be efficient with power and stuff like that. One more setup that we'll talk about here really quickly is going to be my space setup. This should be pretty much exactly what we saw before. There's a couple of extra things here because I want extra doors here to allow vision for my telescope. So I have basically this on a timer so that these are closed until all the Regolith smashing is done, and then they'll open. And then I have these things resting at closed because I don't want the debris. Ooh, here we go. We'll see it later. Well, we probably won't see it at all because it's going to take a long time for this to resolve. But these basically sit open until the debris has fallen through, landed on this platform, so that I'm not getting a bunch of space junk here overheating this telescope. So nothing too crazy, nothing too special compared to what we've seen before, but yeah, you can see all the different practical applications of various automation stuff. I was debating on how to handle this last section I'm going to talk about, and this is really just kind of a miscellaneous. But if you notice inside here, there's a lot of stuff we didn't actually talk about. And that's mainly because I just don't have a lot of practical gameplay reasoning to use some of these things in my own game. Examples of that kind of stuff will be like wattage sensors, weight plates, duplicant checkpoints, memory toggles. Like, there's a bunch of extra stuff that I don't really use. And that's not to say that you shouldn't use them, but if you find a reason to use them, then go for it. There's some other organizational stuff that you can do that I don't actually have researched because I didn't need to have it researched in this run. Like there's cables that you can research that basically allow you to run a bunch of different cables along the same space if you have like a big automation setup. Or you can do some crazy stuff with these like signal selectors and distributors. But I don't really have a practical need for those, and I guess this is just kind of to illustrate a point that you don't need to go too crazy with automation in order to win the game. Automation should just be a tool that you use as heavily or as light as you feel like you're comfortable with, just to get things done. So I realize this is a obscenely long video, but I think the point of these things is like this should ideally be the last tutorial you should need on a lot of this stuff in order to then start completing the game or feel comfortable exploring on your own. So if you're chilling and watching this or second screening it or whatever, then congratulations for making it through the entire video. Drop me a comment down below and I'll give you a nice thumbs up, which will be your reward for making it all this way. And I know that thumbs up means so much on the internet, but for future videos, please leave any comments down below if you want to see anything else in particular. This one in particular was born of a comment that I saw earlier of somebody saying that the automation I was showing in one of my videos was a little bit complicated and they wanted a little bit more of an example. So yeah, let me know if you have any other ideas or any other videos you'd like to see, and drop them down in the comments. Until the next videos, and hopefully they won't be as long as this one, but yeah, until the next videos, I'll see you guys soon.